All right. Hi, everyone. So let's get started. If you've taken a look at Brightspace, you can see that I've made a sort of slight adjustment just along the lines that I mentioned last time. Um, Basically, that entails finishing this material today, finishing new directions in epistemology, particularly the feminist epistemology stuff. Um, And then instead of then starting perception, because really today we're supposed to start our unit on perception, I've kind of bumped that back. So we're just going to finish this today. And then on Wednesday's class, I'll be talking to you about the essay assignment. So I'll give you instructions um, on how to complete that assignment. Um, and we'll come up with some topics together. I do plan on bringing a list of topics. But before I just sort of present that, I think we should try and generate some ideas together for your essay assignments. Okay, we were talking about feminist epistemology, and we left off, uh, yeah, Thursday. So basically, the plan for Thursday is to go over the assignment instructions. Um, a little bit of brainstorming, and then I'll have a list of topics that people can select from, in addition to the ideas that we come up with um, in our brainstorming session. Okay, so we left off right around here. We were talking about objectivity as one of the sort of parts of the legend, right? The legend is this idea of science as this rational, objective, sort of view from nowhere sort of thing, right? So let's talk about objectivity, the objectivity dimension of the legend. As we started to discuss last time, there's an epistemics element to objectivity, this idea that Crumley calls point of view independence, right? We all have our own subjective point of view, but science is supposed to give us this view from nowhere, this objective picture of the world that's not from any single point of view. Another dimension of objectivity is metaphysical. So the idea is that um, science is supposed to tell us what things are actually like. Now, we covered some examples of where this fails, right? Research where um, scientists are less objective or not objective at all than what the sort of legend dictates, right? And Crumley gave some examples, but our examples had to do with, if you'll recall, the uptick in, things like um, ADHD diagnoses or ASD diagnoses for women. So it used to be the scientific consensus that these were conditions that primarily affected males. But of course, now we know that's not true. And it's not because women all of a sudden started um, having ASD and ADHD. It's because we realized we weren't looking at things properly. Okay, yeah. So there's a question about when we get our grades back. I'm We're trying to get that done for the end of the week. So, and of course, when the grades are all finished, um, and we're able to share them, I'll post an announcement on Brightspace. Um, so the essay assignment, well, like I'm going to talk about that more next time. If you're curious about when things are due, that information is in the course outline. So there's no need to check now. I will tell you all about that. I actually don't remember offhand when it's due. Cooper says November 22nd. But yeah, that is all in the course outline. And also in the slides I've posted for Thursday's lecture. So those are already available if you want to take a look at those. Okay. So that was our example. How are feminist epistemologists criticizing objectivity? Well, we can also critique objectivity by denying that there can even be a purely objective science. Because after all, science is something practiced by people. And sure, it's a method that we've developed um, to try and make our knowledge generating efforts less susceptible to human error and human biases. But um, science also reflects the values of the people who are practicing it, or is affected by the values of the people who are practicing it. And the results of science are not um, objective descriptions of the world. They are merely social constructions. So we've got to be a bit tricky with this notion of social construction because social construction does not necessarily imply not real, right? Now, some social constructivists aren't realists, but not all. And what do I mean by realist? I mean that if you're a realist, you believe that there is a real objective reality. Hello. So there's a mind independent reality that continues to exist, um, irrespective of whether you're around to observe things or not. For example, when I was asleep during the night, it's not like my cat here popped out of existence and then popped back into existence when I woke up and came downstairs, right? It's not like my apartment ceased to exist and then popped back into existence or changed somehow while I was unconscious and unable to be here observing it. So if you're a realist, you believe in a mind-independent, objective reality. So to say that certain things are social constructions does not necessarily mean to say they are not real. Although some social constructivists do, but not all. So Linda Fagan does not reject realism, even though she believes that lots of the ways in which we describe the world, the scientific ways we describe the world, are social constructions. In what sense are they social constructions? Well, our standards of justification, what we've been talking about in this class to a great extent so far, are not objective. Rather, they arise from particular social and historical settings. So, science is always sort of happening within a context, within a social or historical context, including um, our um, our standards of justification. And you can see how the standards of justification have changed over the years, right? Early scientists, natural philosophers, would simply observe and describe. Um, and certain things were taken to be, I guess, self-evident through reason, like the Aristotelian idea of a telos, right? The idea of a telos or an end. Everything has a sort of purpose. Um, so to go back to Aristotle's lagoon, um, the insects are there to feed the frogs, and the frogs feed the fish and the birds, etc. Um, the trees provide fruit. These are their ends, right? And understanding that uh, via reason is sufficient. Um, is sufficient justification. Like, oh yeah, the tree provides lots of fruit to feed the birds and all the other creatures. Well, if you think about it, that must be what trees are for, right? Uh, but uh, but uh, but eventually, we decided that we needed to try and verify things. So verification became a standard, like a sort of scientific standard of justification for belief in a proposition. Nowadays, it's falsification. It's what we fail to falsify. So we formulate hypotheses and try and repeatedly prove them wrong. And if we fail to do that, then we can be reasonably confident we've uncovered something about the way the world is. These are all different standards of scientific justification that have been accepted at one point or another through the years. But nowadays, we don't countenance verificationism, for example. Uh, we do falsification. That's an example of how standards of justification are tied to these social and historical settings. Well, a social construction is something that we construct. Um, I mean, why don't we try and come up with an idea let's get clearer on an idea of social constructions, okay? So you've probably heard the term before. Does anyone want to try and offer an example of something that they think is a social construction? Yeah, Quinn, that's right. So gender, race, money, yep, religion, gender roles, yep. You can make a distinction between gender and gender roles, and I think both of them are largely socially constructed. Government, marriage, class, yeah, all good examples. They're all things that we do. Yeah, our definition of art could be seen as a social construction. So um let's look at some of these are all very good examples. The patriarchy, yeah. Yeah, all of these. But let's go with the first three. So gender, race, and money. Um, so gender is separable from sex, right? Gender is your sort of here's a cat. Um, Gender is your sort of experience, well, your own experience of your male or femaleness, right? Um, and that changes from culture to culture. Like what we think of, and this is where we get kind of into gender roles a bit more, like what we think of as masculine or feminine changes from time and place, right? Um, the biological side of things is also a bit messy. Um, but we can point to biological categories like male, female, intersex, for example, and those may not necessarily map on um, to ideas of gender the same way in every time and place. Thanks. Yeah, well, he's a good kitty. Um, and nowadays we're pretty good at making this distinction between sex and gender, right? Like you can say like gender is the social side of things, and sex is the biological side of things, right? Likewise with race. I mean, race is a social construction if there ever was one. Because for most of human history, we didn't really have the concept of race. Um, we had the concept of different peoples, different cultures, different, speakers of different languages, but the idea of a race, as if there are like different biological categories of people is quite recent. And it was more or less invented by um, people doing questionable science in the 18th and 19th centuries. Money is a really good example of a social construct because, it only has value because we value it. When people argue, if you're arguing with an internet troll or something who's like, um, social constructions aren't real, like those internet trolls who say, oh, there's only two genders or something, right? The other new more like, well, not new categories per se, but like um gender categories that are getting a little bit more attention, like say trans men and trans women. You sometimes meet with these bigots who deny that this is a thing and that it's all about biological sex and social constructions aren't real. Well, what you do is you then ask them for all of their money because money is a social construct. But I doubt any of us here would just say, oh, well, since money's just a social construct and it's not real, then I don't care about having it anymore. Right? You're not just going to give me all of your money just because I tell you it's a social construct and it's not real, right? So that's what I mean also when I said earlier that if you're a social constructivist who does not deny or who does not endorse anti-realism, like you're saying, like, look, these things are real things that people do, but the social construction side of things is the fact that it's people doing them, right? So money is a social construct, but that certainly doesn't, like social constructs are still real and they matter. Um, So is everyone clear on the idea of social constructions? Very good. Theories, according to Fagan, are also underdetermined by evidence. So we could be dealing with a scientific theory where, we don't have, or rather, two scientific theories, two, competing theories um, that could explain reality equally well, but it's values, the values of the people in the society at the time that decide which one we believe. So, for example, the old debate in early modern Europe over geocentrism versus heliocentrism, right? Um, so the received view was geocentrism, the idea that the Earth is at the center of the cosmos, and people, um, this really was underdetermined um, by the evidence. People claimed that the Earth was the center of the cosmos by appealing to Aristotelian physics or the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, where um, retrograde motion was explained by placing the planets on these crystal spheres. So retrograde motion, if you don't know, if you go out and observe the night sky over a period of months, the stars are more or less fixed from our point of view on Earth. Although every night they do appear to sort of turn around the celestial North Pole. But the planets wander. And planet comes from planetai, which is Greek, which means wanderer, right? So over the year, you'll see your planets moving through the sky and then back a little bit and then forward again. And that's retrograde motion, right? And the Ptolemaic model explained this by saying that, well, everything really orbits the Earth, and they do so on these crystal spheres, which themselves are always turning. So you get this like almost like spirographical picture of the planet's orbits, super complicated. And then along comes Copernicus and says, well, what if we put the sun in the middle? and we say that Earth goes around the sun, we actually get a much simpler picture of all of the orbits of planets. Now, here's the interesting thing. Copernicus's model didn't explain retrograde motion any better than Ptolemy's model. It actually only did just as well as Ptolemy's model. And that's because Copernicus had his planets going around the sun in circles and not ellipses. So it wasn't until we later discovered that planets orbit in ellipses rather than perfect circles that we knew for certain that heliocentrism was the correct answer. Before we knew that, the theories were underdetermined, and what people believed um, was based on their values, whether they valued Aristotelian physics or the dogma of the Catholic Church, which was that the Earth was at the center of the cosmos, right? So, um, critics of the legend point out like that we want science to be objective, but we're dealing with social constructions, and we're dealing with competition between theories that are underdetermined by evidence. So, values are the deciding factor, and these change from time and place over the years. But I don't want to misrepresent Fagin, right? She's not arguing against the metaphysical stuff, just the epistemic stuff. She's saying, look, there is an objective reality out there that we can learn about with science. But what we really need to keep in mind is that science is done by people and people's values, and the social constructions of our particular times and place, the values of a particular time and place will uh, will determine which theories we endorse and which we reject. So it's funny because science is trying to be completely objective. Science is trying to operate from this view from nowhere. And arguably, this is a good thing if we can make science objective. Like we need things like, double-blind uh, studies, double-blind clinical trials, right? We need to be able to do those things, but we also shouldn't forget that it's human beings who are doing the science, right? And some of the claims of the feminist epistemologists get a little more radical, perhaps a bit more controversial when they are extended to the arrangement of society or to the power structures within society. Um, this is really, and we're not going to talk about this too much, but this is really like what radical feminism is about. Like radical feminism, more, for lack of a better term, uh, good old fashioned feminism. Not that it's that simple, okay? Um, but I guess feminism is traditionally conceived as is about equality between the sexes and kind of remedying inequality, whereas radical feminism is about dismantling the patriarchy, like taking it apart and putting things back together in a way where we actually do achieve equality of the sexes, right? Or equality of the genders, I should probably say. Um, what do you think? What do you think about the notion of social construction? What do you think about dismantling the patriarchy? I still want to hear from lots of you, just like I did last time. So, Rachel, go ahead.
I just think, especially when we're talking about social constructs, I just find it very inevitable. So it makes sense to me when we're talking about this because we are dealing with people and there's not really a reality where people are not here doing these things.
Yeah. It would seem like if we took all of the social constructs away, well, you can't even imagine what human society would look like because so much of what we do, like it depends on things that we come up with. And I don't say make up because that implies like, they're just made, they're like these constructions are not constructed out of whole cloth. They're not just made up out of thin air, right? Yeah, Quinn, that's a good point. Like radical feminism might even say like, hey, let's forget about sex and gender altogether. We can just say like we could drop these concepts. Although, you know, this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, so I should say I'm no expert on gender theory or sociology. I'm certainly not. But yeah, I guess some radical feminists could do that, right? So, like, yeah, I get it. I still think that science needs to be objective, but I think yeah, it is very, it's problematic when we forget that science is a human enterprise, right? Kaya says it's easier to do nothing and let shared understandings or social constructs that build the patriarchy run freely. It's up to every individual to work on breaking things down and acting different. Everyone upholds it in a different way. If I had a daughter and dressed her in pink, even though it's innocent, it's yeah, good example, perpetuating that girls wear pink. Yeah, like you kind of have to, if I can borrow the phrase, be the change you want to see, right? If you want to fight the patriarchy, if you want to dismantle the patriarchy, just stop doing patriarchal things. And I don't just mean things that men do, right? I mean that like the idea of gendered clothing or gendered toys, right? Um but again, this changes over the years. Did you know that before the advent of the personal computer, the split of men and women in computer science was about 50-50? And then the personal computer was marketed primarily to men and boys. And all of a sudden, we stopped seeing so many women in computer science and by extension in other, STEM fields just because of the way we were marketing the computer. And it was marketed, on the assumption, I guess, of the marketing people that girls weren't into computers, which is just ridiculous because some of the most important early computer programmers were women, right? Um, so it's completely made up, that oh, women aren't interested in computers and computation. Says who? I don't know, the marketing department. Like, and look at the real effects that it's had, with over concerning women in STEM fields like science. What's that stand for? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? Something like that. So, this has real world effects. So, um, I guess on social constructivism, we can say that the world's objects and their properties depend in some way on our concepts, our beliefs. Some are a little bit more radical, like some would say like it's all a social construction, and some would say like no, like Linda Fagan would say no, there's still a world out there that's independent of us, but the way we understand it is shaped by our concepts, right? Noamine says, since these concepts are so deeply rooted in our society, it would have more negative ramifications to strip them indefinitely. Um, it is a process that will take a long time and a lot of people to take accountability, which is a damn miracle. Yeah. Contracts keep order to an extent until it becomes like a social contract, I assume you mean. But yeah. Um, well, I guess, yeah, there are those who would say that things need to be changed gradually or ought to be changed gradually. And then there are the people who would advocate for a revolution, maybe, right? Um, I don't know. Slow and steady wins the race. And, the arc of history bends toward justice and, all of those platitudes, right? Um, but it's true. Like, just think of the small things that you can do, um, to be less patriarchal. even one of the things, it's a small thing, but one of the things that you'll see in the instructions for your essays is um, is that I like it when my students use gender inclusive language, right? I don't want to hear like in your paper, since the beginning of time, mankind has wondered about philosophy, right? I don't want to hear that. I want you to talk about humanity, not mankind, right? When you use example individuals in your paper, don't just use men, right? And you might think, well, of course, Professor Redstone, why would we do that? Well, I'm not saying you will. It's just like, 50 years ago, that was the standard thing to do. It was mankind. It was man, man, man. It was all men. It was like women didn't exist in philosophy or something, even though there were certainly women philosophers, right? So it's a little thing you can do. Yeah, Rachel, exactly. When Star Trek, yeah, because when it was the original series, it was where no man has gone before. When we got Next Generation, they changed it. And they also changed it in that final movie with Kirk, The Undiscovered Country. Sorry, I'm a Star Trek nerd. But yeah, at the end of the last movie with the original crew, not the reboot, not the J.J. Abrams ones, but the with the original cast. Um, at the end of the movie, Kirk says, "We're no man, we're no one," and he corrects himself. And that kind of is like the magic moment when it happened, right? Oh, Data's my one of my favorite characters, absolutely. Um, I teach a lot about, and I do a lot of research on human robot interaction and whether robots can be intelligent or conscious, etc. So a lot of that is probably due to watching the Data episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation for real. Mm. So, okay, Kaya also said earlier it takes decades, if not centuries, to undo harmful social constructs, like how women are inferior. Yeah, we do have a lot of progress, and that's why we do have a lot of we've made a lot of progress, but we have a lot of work yet to do, and also maintaining the progress that we've achieved so far. I mean, some people would even tell you that, well, we've achieved equality between the genders, so we don't need feminism anymore. And it's like, well, that's a pretty bad take because, what like women, for example, have gained in terms of equality can easily be lost. And we've seen that very recently. Um, with the restrictions in access to reproductive health care in the United States, for example. Yeah, some people might. I mean, this is mostly people on the internet, like trolls, not real philosophers, but yeah. Yeah, and Quinn, that's a good point. I mean, some of our social constructs might be for upholding the patriarchy, and those are what we need to get rid of. But since it's a construction, it can be changed, right? But yeah, we have to be careful. Yes, women, for example, are a lot more equal than they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but that doesn't mean that feminism is over, right? Um, there are still patriarchal individuals and institutions, not to mention downright misogynistic individuals, right? I mean, forget about patriarchal. There are very, very toxic individuals out there. Your Andrew Tates of the world, right? And as long as people like that exist, we need feminism. Yeah. Yeah, that's true, Kaya. Sometimes people will also, I mean, people engage in bad faith arguments, right? Where, I don't think they really believe what they're saying. But yeah, I have heard some people claim that, well, okay, who cares about feminism? Women can vote, women can have jobs, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need feminism anymore. And it's like, well, we do, because I mean, those rights can be taken away, right? I mean, women still don't. have exact parity with men when it comes to, things like hourly wage, right? Still. And of course, let's remember that there are places in the world where, things are still less equal than they are here, for example, right? So, um, I don't know. What do we all think? Can we still be objective in a world like this? Think about it. Well, okay, April, go ahead.
Okay, so I kind of have an example, like a personal example for this. So I used to work construction with my husband on the same construction site. Like our crew was great. They accepted me. They were like totally fine with me, not a problem. So we're working on an apartment building and you have like the electricians, the plumbers, the glazers, like there's different groups of people in there, right? Um, I ended up getting pregnant with my youngest, and my boss was great. He was like, I've got jobs that as you get to different stages, you're able to do. He was very, very good with keeping me included in it. Like, he was fine with it. But there was another guy who was on a different crew who did not, I guess, agree with me being um, employed and pregnant on a construction site, even though I had no problem holding my own. So
Yeah.
he actually got to the point where he was just getting downright rude and like physically in my face.
Hmm.
So he ended up being reprimanded for it. And it was actually my boss who advocated for me on that one. But I was definitely like the only woman on that
Hmm.
job site. So there was a clear, like, there was clear men who had no problem with me being there, no problem with working with me. They had no problem, like, they didn't cater to me. They didn't say, hey, can I get that for you? Like, nothing like that. Didn't matter what stage I was at. And there was other men were like, oh, you shouldn't do that. And I just kind of look at them and I'm like, why? Why can I not
Yeah.
do this? Right? Like, pick up a bag of dustpan, it's 50 pounds. I can do it, not a problem. Get out of my face and walk away.
Yeah. And that's a good example. That does reflect certain gender stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
The idea that women are perhaps these, delicate things, right? That shouldn't work. Um, but if you look into our hunter-gatherer past, women were still doing stuff um while carrying children, right? Still hunting and gathering all the way back in the day in our Pleistocene era past, right? Um so that's a really interesting example because we can actually look objectively and know that across time and space, um, pregnant women are able to work either hunting and gathering all the way up to working at a construction site, right? But it's this social sort of this concept we have that really is part of a problematic gender stereotype that maybe was at play with this guy who was a jerk at your work, right?
Yeah, he was special. But
Yeah.
he um very quickly learned that he couldn't do that. And like even his boss, I was actually quite close with him. Uh he apologized to me and said that um like it doesn't matter what stage you're at, you're doing your job and he should not be interfering with that. And he even told me like if you're having issues, please speak up. Because I at first didn't want to say anything
Yeah.
because I was the only woman who was on the job site and I didn't want to create a problem. Like when my husband and I told our boss that we were pregnant, I told him because I was under my 3 months and I said, like, I am pregnant. I am still within my 3 months and I need you to make the decision that is going to be less of a headache for like not less of a headache, but is going to bring you less like blowback in a way that there's nothing that could potentially legally take place.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
because I know that because I'm a woman and I'm pregnant on a job site, it doesn't matter. People can find ways around that.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I don't have firsthand experience with this myself, but I certainly know other women that have been in a similar situation. Like actually my sister for a long time was a welder and was also usually, if not the only woman, one of the only women. And she ended up leaving that vocation just because she was sick of the work culture, which had a lot to do with like toxic masculinity and stuff. Jonas has a question. Is there a difference between social concepts of gender, money, etc., versus socially accepted actions? It's frowned upon to scream at people walking down the street for no reason, right? Yeah. Um, um, so I would say, Jonas, that some of those things are like social conventions. Like there are conventions and norms that govern behavior, and those are socially constructed as well. Um, But with somebody like Andrew Tate, it's not just behavior, it's also ideology, if you like. Um, like he and his brother have a very, very misogynistic outlook, um, where, they're not just being rude, right? They're being like hateful. Um, so there are social conventions, which are social constructs. Um, Nomin says if it's all just radical change, there is a higher chance of pushback, and it prevents sustaining long-term change that the larger society accepts. Pulling the rug from under a misogynist, they are more likely to overtly reject it and act out, causing more issues. Okay, perhaps. Kaya responded by saying it's tricky because you have to combat it with kindness or politeness, but they are allowed to be rude. They don't deserve the kindness, but it's the only option if you don't want. Yeah, the convoy versus the peaceful protest for Palestine. Yeah, good point. Um, Chloe says, haven't there been assumptions that all hunters were men? Um, well, yeah, that's kind of what I was saying. Women did participate in not just gathering, but also hunting. And you're right that this is a sort of bias, a gender bias that actually led anthropologists to misunderstand some prehistoric human societies. As women absolutely did go on hunts. Um, the whole idea that there was a strict division of labor between men and women in our evolutionary past where men hunted and women gathered is a huge oversimplification, right? Um, Everybody kind of did a little bit of everything. Um, so yeah, okay, we better move along. I'm just gonna grab some coffee. Oh, whoa. Okay, here we are. All right. Yeah, like Quinn and Nomin are saying, and Kaya, yeah, sometimes it's annoying to have to deal with the ignorance, right? Like, whose example was it? The where's the chat gone? Yeah, Kaya's example of the trucker convoy versus the protests in support of the Palestinians, right? Am I not sharing my screen anymore? No, I'm screen sharing. Um, because um, I was here when that happened. Um, and one of the things that really struck me here when the occupation happened, right? And one of the things that struck me was just the sense of entitlement. Um, Um, the protests for Palestine, right? They take place. Um, people show up, they do the protest, and then they go home. They don't take over um, the entire downtown core, right? Um, so yeah, like it's hard to respond to like the truck people um in a civil way, I suppose, but um yeah, I guess like Hale says, some people are not going to change. Um so anyway, let's talk about reason. We've talked about objectivity, now we should talk about reason. Um reason is one of those things that is essential to the human being. A lot of philosophers over the years have said that, oh, excuse me, that it is our reason that makes us special. Um, Now, there's no single feminist theory on how reason and gender are related. But a lot of feminist thinkers do argue that reason has been used to support these androcentric views, these male-centered views. And so, for that reason, we can think of reason itself as a gendered concept. In fact, Genevieve Lloyd argues that reliance on reason in Western philosophy is itself androcentric, right? There's this sort of masculine bias when it comes to reason that men are rational and reasonable, right? And this I think probably goes well. Crumley says it's due to the sort of thinking we find in Descartes, but it certainly precedes that. It goes all the way back to Plato. But Descartes, if you remember, Descartes thinks the human being is ultimately a thinking thing. So it's a disembodied, incorporeal, non-physical mind, ultimately. And reason is not affected by the body, or ought not to be. Um, Descartes also living in a time when women had very few rights compared to today. Um, I mean, to have any sense of freedom or as a woman, you would have had to have been a member of the aristocracy. Like Descartes had women students, but they were all royalty, right? If you wanted to study philosophy, um, you had to be a man from the upper classes, or lucky enough to get a scholarship or something to go to university, or basically a noble woman. Uh, so that's quite androcentric. Um, Reason ought not to be affected by the body, by the passions or the emotions. And of course, women have traditionally been seen as more emotional and men more reasonable. But again, this goes back to Plato. Like Plato thought that, um, actually the soul has sort of three parts. And we have logos or reason. That's what makes us special. But there's also an appetitive soul and a spirited soul. So that's our appetites and drives on the one hand, and our emotions on the other. And he offers this analogy of a chariot where the appetitive soul and the spirited soul are two horses, and the charioteer is reason. And the charioteer's job is to make sure that the horses pull the chariot properly and don't fight one another and so on, right? So that's why this is considered androcentric, right? Um, it comes down to that bias. Men are reasonable, women emotional, which I'm not saying is true. Um, right. But feminist thinkers have argued that traditionally this is the way women have been looked at, right? Yeah, no, not really. Um, well, I mean, the Cartesian view of reason is very much aligned with that sort of like reason gives us the view from nowhere. Oh, um, so reason we could see as a gendered concept. Um, and it's always been there. If you read Plato, I mean, Plato's whole idea of reason and rational discourse, like it's almost comically masculine. Like, so if you read the Phaedo, which is the account of the last hours of Socrates' life when he's in prison. So he's been put on trial for impiety and for corrupting the youth of Athens. He's been found guilty of a jury by a jury of his peers, and he's sentenced to die by drinking hemlock. And he's been sitting in prison for a while because it's basically been like a holiday, and they're waiting for this ship to go to and from Delos to commemorate to commemorate some heroic Greek figure, right? So while the ship is on its way to and from Delos, no blood can be spilled. So Socrates has just been hanging out in prison with his friends, talking philosophy. And then finally word comes down that okay, the ship is back. Socrates is going to be executed tomorrow. And Socrates' wife is just his wife Xanthippe is in tears, like, oh no, Socrates, my poor Socrates, you're gonna die. And Socrates rather callously just says, "Okay, can someone just like take her away? And me and the boys are gonna talk about philosophy until I'm executed." You know, again, this is Plato's. We don't know if this is really what happened, but this is Plato's story. But yeah, like, oh, let's not worry about the fact that I'm about to die and get all upset. Um, let's talk about the soul, and let's talk about philosophy, and let's talk about the forms, right? And so they're at it until the wee hours of the morning, and by the end of it, all Socrates' friends are crying, and Socrates is like, "Hey, oh, should I have sent you guys away with my wife who was crying, you big babies?" Like so. This kind of like almost comically masculine view of reason is very old. Um, so. But yeah, reason, a gendered concept, arguably. Um, Margaret Atherton agrees with Haslinger on this too. Maybe Descartes' own views shaped the concept of masculinity in the sense that, we think, or people tend to think that men are more reasonable, um, because there's a sort of, I don't know, cultural precedent. I mean, we expect men to be reasonable in the way that Descartes describes. So maybe men try to appear that way. Maybe men try to be less emotional, right? You see this, it's like a trope in movies, like, like when if a man cries, like, I'm not crying, I've just got something in my eye. You know what I mean? Like that, there's that kind of thing, right? April, go ahead.
So with this whole men being like the voice of reason basically, can that also be connected with like looking at the men being like the ultimate decision makers as well, like the head of the house, the decision makers, like they need to be the ones to make the rash decisions because obviously women can't because we just get too emotional.
Yeah, yeah. And then again goes back to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle, for example, would have argued that the most reasonable people were older men, like men with life experience and practical wisdom. Um, Women, older, wealthy Greek men. Um, Women were less rational. Non-Greeks or barbarians were less rational, right? In fact, Aristotle used this to argue that it was naturally justified for the Greeks to have slaves. He said, okay, these barbarians, these barbaroi, they call them barbarians because to the Greeks, they sounded like bar, 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 bar. It's kind of our equivalent of blah, 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 blah today. So the barbarians, the barbaroi, clearly aren't as reasonable as us Greeks. So it's okay for us to enslave some of them because they don't know any better, right? Um, and children, obviously, for Aristotle, are also completely unreasonable. So, yeah, women, children, and slaves, no reason. Older men with some life experience and some money and property, wise. That's Aristotle for you. I mean, I like a lot of Aristotle, but I don't like this part of Aristotle. Um, so, yeah, we better keep going so that we can finish. So, what do we do? Well, the critiques of traditional epistemology that we've looked at today lead to a couple of options: feminist standpoint epistemology and feminist naturalized epistemology. So, standpoint epistemology, the feminist standpoint epistemology, says that knowledge is the outcome of a social process. So, knowledge is a social product, right? Knowledge is not necessarily of an objective reality, but something that a whole bunch of people working within a specific context have made. Moreover, what we need to do if we're taking the feminist standpoint approach is privilege the perspective of women. The reason is that, as we've seen, their perspective has been neglected in the history of science. So we should start listening to them more, right? Um, we can try to be less biased, but we also need to realize that science is never going to be completely value free or value neutral because it is a human enterprise. So, we're gonna try and be as objective as we can, but we're gonna realize or try and keep in mind that as humans, there's only we can only be so objective. Or we could take the approach of feminist naturalized epistemology. So that combines what we were talking about last week with Quine with these feminist critiques that we've talked about today. So epistemology is part of the sciences, like Quine said, but as a science, we need to keep in mind that um, women have been marginalized in the sciences. So we need to keep that in mind. Um, we like with standpoint theory, we keep in mind that scientific inquiry is situated within a social and historical context. Um, Once we do that, once we're more aware of the context and of our biases, we can go ahead and do better science and better epistemology. Now, that's really all I have. But this has been a really great discussion, and we could keep it going for a couple more minutes. Um, what do we think? Are we, you can imagine this as a sort of continuum or a spectrum where some social constructivists will say, oh, yeah, everything is a social construct, like the postmodernists. And others will say, no, there is an objective reality. But I think most of us are probably going to fall somewhere along that continuum and not at either extreme, right? I don't know. April, what do you think?
Um, so I see that like change has been happening over time, but I think with the change, I'm wondering if some of it is just tolerated and some of it is actually like supported. I don't know if that
Hmm.
makes sense. So like when we come to looking at sciences, um, my sister-in-law is in um, she's working for her PhD with infectious diseases, specifically cancer. She's honest to goodness, probably one of the, she does a lot of work. Anyways, the amount of railroading she has hit because of the male-dominated labs that are being run, she's actually got a case where she can take it to court and fight that she didn't get her
Mm.
education because her supervisor won't supervise her anymore.
Hmm.
So she's actually had a meeting with the board and they said the amount of work that you've done, you can actually publish um, a couple of papers all by herself. Like they
Mm.
have literally, destroyed her. They have undermined her in quite a few ways, taken her ideas, had other men publish them. She's been like, it's not been a great time for her that way.
Yeah.
So the board actually said, like, go ahead and write your thesis at this point. Like, we're not gonna ask you to interact with them anymore. So, but like it just shows you, like, as a woman, she brought in the funding. She was the one who was coming up with the ideas. She was the one who was doing all of these things, but yet the men were taking it over
Hmm.
because for whatever reason, she couldn't have done that. So there's a lot of like, I see where there has been growth, but I also see where like there really has not been at the same time.
Yeah. It reminds me, well, your story reminds me of the whole Watson and Crick thing with the discovery of the structure of DNA. I mean, when I was in high school, I learned it was um, John Watson and Francis Crick, right, who co-discovered the double helical structure of DNA. Um, but it turns out actually what they had discovered was someone's lab notes. I'm oversimplifying, and if somebody can Google the name of the scientist who I'm talking about, it's always see, this is the patriarchy. I remember Watson and Crick like that because that's what I was taught in high school. But when I read years later, oh, it was actually this woman who was working on this and made the important contributions. Because I learned that so much later, I have trouble recollecting it, and I have to Google it. That's the patriarchy, you know? Rosalind Franklin. Yeah, good. Thank you, Karen and Hussam. That's right. It was Rosalind Franklin. That's right, an X-ray crystallographer. And there are moments in science when women have rightly been celebrated. So I mean, Marie Curie. I mean, you've got to give it to Marie Curie. The only scientist, forget about the only woman, the only scientist to have a Nobel Prize, to have like two Nobel Prizes in like two different things. Um so good for her. Um Ada Lovelace, the first computer programmer. Um there are some celebrated examples. If you want to go back to the ancient Greeks, Hypatia. Hypatia was a scientist, a great woman scientist, who worked out of the library in Alexandria. Oh, really? The first person to, oh, that's cool. First person to drive a car was, I did not know that. But yeah, unfortunately, the much more common examples, and we don't even know how many examples that there are because it's probably happened so much. But there are a lot of examples of male scientists taking credit for the work of women who are just as smart and capable. Oh, Bertha Benz, that's cool. Bertha Benz, Bertha Benz, that would be a good drag queen name. I don't know why I thought of that. Bertha Benz. You could come in like dressed up as a car. That would be pretty sick. Um, no disrespect to the historical Bertha Benz. Amy has a question. Um, Sorry. Yeah, Grace Hopper's another one. Yeah, Grace Hopper, I think, was the computer scientist who originated BASIC. And she was like an admiral in the Navy. And she worked on cryptography during the Second World War. Yeah, and the moon landing. Um, well, that was back when a lot of the computers were still women. So, if you've seen that movie Hidden Figures, it covers it quite well. There were there were three women of color who were very important in the space race, which America was losing, by the way, until they got to the moon, right? So sorry, let me get to Amy's question. So modern versus strong foundationalism. What's the difference basically? So there's some small differences. Not every strong foundationalism, not every strong foundationalist is going to say the same kind of beliefs or basic beliefs, but whatever kind of beliefs are your basic beliefs, they are just beliefs that don't need to be justified by other beliefs. So that could include perceptions. Um, I hope that answers that question. Um, yeah, well, Kale, the reason why we celebrate those done by women is because we kind of take for granted that it's men who are inventing things, right? Um, which is a problem. Women are just as I said, women are just as smart and capable. Like Grace Hopper, Ada Lovelace, we've mentioned these folks. Um, Prior to the PC being marketed as this sort of home device, it was about 50-50 men and women in computer science. And just marketing computers to boys because it was thought that because some marketing people thought, oh, could those newfangled computers, oh, only the boys are interested in those, right? That's made it so that I grew up with that when the PC in the 90s, like when everyone had a computer, um it was gendered. Like the people who knew them, like everybody I knew could use a computer, but it was the men who were expected to know how they worked. Do you know what I mean? Kind of like maybe how for my parents' generation, or arguably still my generation, the assumption is that men know how cars work and women don't. Like, I don't know. I know plenty women who know how cars work. I don't really have a very good idea how cars work. Like, I know the basics. I know that there's an engine and the thing, the cylinders and the spark plugs and etc. Like, I got a basic idea, but I'm no car person. So, yeah, I can't really think of much else to say on this, unless some more of you have some further thoughts. Yeah, sometimes you have to have your token male, Sarah. Like, this has happened to my partner actually, right? Um, we have friends who sometimes organize social events and will sometimes work at the door. And so my partner will be the ticket taker, taking tickets. And I'll just be there hanging out. Like I'm not even working. I'm just keeping her company. And people come in and like immediately look at me and start talking to me. And I'm like, I'm just standing here. I'm not, talk to her, right? So that's one thing I've noticed. Or when we're shopping, um, for something, the salesperson will just kind of tend to talk to me, and I'm like, she's here too. So Rachel, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment that I really like the feminist standpoint because whenever we engage in discussions about the nature of knowledge and like try to answer epistemic questions, I always get stuck on the fact that knowledge is a social product. So seeing that like it really resonated with me because I always think about that and I get stuck on it because we're the ones that engage and create with this, and I don't think we can have knowledge without subjective understanding. So I just think it's all social. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. Like, and the way I look at it is like science gives us a sort of representation of the way the world is, but we can't ever be so objective that we could know exactly what the world is. I mean, I guess I'm kind of like a Kantian on this, where remember how Kant said the mind structures our experience of the world so that we can only really ever know the phenomenal and not the noumenal. Like, it doesn't even make sense to ask what the noumenal is really like, what things in themselves are really like. There's no way to know that, right? So science tries to represent reality as best it can, but because it's done by people, it's going to go wrong sometimes. And that doesn't mean that there is no objective reality. It's just, for me at least, um, we're going to get closer to that objective reality if we acknowledge that we are all individual subjects who are doing the science, right? Um, so that's kind of the way I look at it. Any other thoughts? Remy, I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, all ideas you can criticize. I mean, criticize doesn't necessarily mean to dismiss, right? Um, I mean, I say that this class is a safe place for open discussion, as long as everyone is respectful. Um, you can go ahead and say what you are thinking. I will mention that I think a lot of people still to this day misunderstand feminism. Um, the way it's misunderstood probably depends on who we're talking about. But just yeah, I think people tend to, especially men, kind of tend to get the wrong idea about what it is. Go ahead, April.
I'm going to agree with you on that one. I think um, when people are misunderstanding it, they have that view of irrational women and they go more to that rationalized, like the extremist of the feminism, right? Where there's chaos. But I feel like the true, not true, that's not the right wording, but I feel like feminism is one of those things where, it's rational, it's logical, and it tries to remove, um, it's more neutral, right? It wants to remove the gender norms. It wants like those social constructs that are put in place of gender and race and those intersectional pieces that can create blockades for people, right? It tries
Yeah.
to remove all of that. So I like the fact that when we're looking at feminism, we're looking at it in a way that it's being presented as the naturalized, right? The standpoint. And um, it's not one of those like extreme standpoints.
Yeah, and I mean, it reminds me of Well, what Kaya says here in the chat, fun fact, men don't like the patriarchy either. And that's something I think the misunderstanders don't quite get. Like, feminism is saying that the patriarchy is bad for women, but it's also bad for men. Like, the whole idea, and this gets to Remy's question, like, reason is a gendered concept. Men are supposed to be reasonable and non-emotional. Well, how many men are there that succumb to um, mental health problems, substance abuse problems, etc., because they don't process their emotions properly, right? Um, like, this is bad for men too, you know. Um, Kaya continues. Yeah, they're intimidated. Patriarchy shames them for not participating in it and rewards them when they do. Patriarchy is not good for all men, but is accessible to all men if they. Yeah, yeah. Um, so good. The chat's really going crazy, but I want to get to Remy's question. Um, Remy says, I think I disagree that reason itself is a gendered construct. As it was presented today, the perceived gendered aspect of reason is seemingly descriptive of men and women and not reason itself. I mean, that's fair. And in a sense, like, I get what you're saying, right? Like, there is reason, and reason should be gender neutral, value neutral, objective. Like, yeah, like reason is supposed to be, as Descartes put it, this universal instrument. You're right about that. But where it gets gendered is, again, our own ideas about what reason is. So, if, for example, somebody says, well, men are more reasonable and women more emotional, that is a gendering of reason. So it's not like reason ought to be gendered, but it is because of the way that we think about it and what we do with it at different times and places. So, like, yeah, I think reason should be a neutral, universal instrument for revealing the truth. And I believe that men and women, but I believe that men and women can both reason. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, like, these philosophers that we've looked at today, Remy, are not like criticizing reason per se. They're saying, look, our concept of reason is gendered. And if we want to be more reasonable, we should try and look at the ways it is gendered and realize that women can be rational and men can be emotional, right? In fact, men are hyper emotional. I mean, men are the ones who get aggressive, right? If we're trying to have a rational discussion, it's men who will break out into a fight over what we're discussing. um you know yeah, Kaya, that's right, there are revolutionary feminists, radical feminists. So um Remy, then it is gendered. Well, that's what we're saying. Like, reason is a social construct. um and so it's never like it's what reason is, what we make of it. Quite literally, reason is what we make of it. And if we make it gendered, that's not going to be good. But yeah, there's some differences between the revolutionary and the reforming feminists, like Kaya says. Um, and that's a good point. Like, and we'll end there. Like, feminism is not a monolithic movement. Like, there have been multiple waves throughout history. Different feminist thinkers are going to argue for different things. Some will argue for equality. Some will argue for dismantling the patriarchy. Um, but just keep the general idea in mind that um, reason and objectivity might not work the way in the same way, as indicated to us by the legend, right? Which is why it's called the legend. Okay, so that's really good. That's all for today. Thanks a lot. Really good discussions today. As I said, next time I'm going to tell you all about the essay assignment, and then when we come back next week, we'll be talking about perception. So you can get started on reading that chapter in Crumley, but for the next class, there are no readings. It will just be my instructions. Um, yeah, yeah, Joey, that's right. I mean, male scientists used to literally get into duels to decide scientific truth. Like I mentioned, the Copernican model and heliocentrism and the discovery that planets move in ellipses. This is due to Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe had a prosthetic golden nose because he lost his original nose in a duel with swords over with another scientist, and they were dueling about who was the better mathematician. So, that's men for you. Yeah, or Galois who died in a duel. Like, yeah, there's like I'm a scientist and I'm such a good scientist, I'll prove it by fighting you with my sword. Like, okay. Um so that's men for you. Um Now, okay, I better let things go here. But thanks everybody. I'll see you next time when we talk about the essay assignment. So take care. See you on Thursday. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.